Well, this afternoon we're joined by Stuart Olyott, who has written a number of books with the banner, including Ministering Like the Master, Preaching That Gets Through, Reading the Bible and Praying in Public, and I Wish Someone Would Explain Hebrews to Me. He's also translated a shorter book from the pen of John Calvin, which we've titled Truth for All Time. Stuart, it's a real delight to have you with us.
It's a true pleasure to be at the Banner Conference again.
It would be lovely to hear something of your life story. I'm eager to hear where you grew up and how it was that the Lord first drew you to himself.
Well, I was born in what's now Pakistan in 1942. My father was a military engineer who built roads and bridges and airports and things. And I was born on the northwest frontier of India, as it was then, and had my early childhood in Asia with a brief visit back to Britain. Came back to Britain definitively when I was just about 10 years old. Both my parents were extremely wonderful Christians. They were folk of integrity, and I grew up with two great impressions. One is that there's nothing more important in all the world than spiritual things. And the most important trait in a character is integrity, total honesty and reliability. They modeled that for me. They were not well taught because we were a military family. My parents were married 50 years and they moved 51 times. And I went to 9 junior schools before I started at secondary school. So that was normal to us. It wasn't in any way disrupting in any way because we didn't know anything else at all. By the time I was about 14, I was under enormous conviction of sin. I knew my parents' faith was correct because I just saw it worked in their lives. But I also had an enormous amount of friends, and I was convinced as a boy that if I became a Christian, I would lose my friends. So I was resisting this conviction of sin which was propelling me towards Christ. Simply because I just didn't want to be lonely, I suppose. I went away to stay with my grandmother in Colchester, Essex. My mother was Welsh, but my father was from Essex. And on the Sunday, she didn't make me go to church, and I felt as free as a bird, and I thought, this is it, I've made it, I can make my break now, and when I go back home, I can tell them I'm not going to church anymore. But strangely, that afternoon of that Sunday in 1957, in late August, I was very hungry to be in the presence of the Bible. I have no idea why. Well, I do know why, but at the time it was a complete mystery to me. So I just wanted and knew that I had to be in the presence of the Bible, but I didn't want to be converted. But there was a liberal Baptist church in the town, which I knew, and I went there on the Sunday evening, and the minister took the meeting in his normal sort of way. And then just before he was supposed to preach, he said, I'm not going to preach tonight. I've asked a friend to tell us his life story. And this man got into the pulpit and gave us his testimony. As he did so, this extraordinary sense of God came over me, which left me bewildered and perplexed and frightened, and I was in total disarray. I knew that something had happened on the cross which would put me right with God, but I couldn't have told you what it was, even though I had a Christian upbringing. I hadn't made that connect at that point. But I cried out to the Lord to have mercy on me, and I went home different. Something must have happened because there was a new teacher in our school, and a few weeks later, as I walked down the corridor, he said to me, he said, "Are you Olyott?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "You and I are going to start a Christian union." So we did. And that's how I got my appetite that was the beginning of appetite to serve the Lord. It was just a wonderful thing to serve the Lord in the context of a school. I didn't lose my friends, by the way. Our relationship changed, but I didn't lose my friends. I joined a little Baptist church in Chester where we were living at the time. They loved the Lord. They loved his day. They loved each other. They loved the gospel. that's why I had but we didn't have a pastor. Every Sunday morning was consecration, and every Sunday evening was conversion. That was the diet. But I did grow in grace there, and had a great desire to preach. Do you want to keep going?
Well, I was going to... absolutely.
Okay. Well, I went to the deacons of the church and said, I have this great desire to preach. And they said, you're too young. You must wait. There was no minister in the church. So I went down the road to the Methodist minister and said, I must preach. And he said, great. He said, we can't get preachers for our circuit, especially in the little country chapels. So I began to preach for the Methodists. I did that for a year.
Sorry, how old would you have been at this point?
I preached my first sermon the day before my 17th birthday. So I preached in the villages of Cheshire and one or two villages in North Wales. And my deacons eventually then came to me and said, you're preaching for the Methodists? I said, yes. So they said, well, you'll have to preach for us then, won't you? So I was then enabled to preach in my own church. Yeah. From there I went to London Bible College. I studied at the university at the same time as we did in those days. And while I was there, I had made a covenant with God that if a church called me unanimously, I would go into the pastoral ministry. Otherwise, I felt I should go to the mission field and had Brazil in mind. And in my 7th term at college, a church gave me a unanimous call. I was called to Poplar Baptist Church in East London. So that's where I started at the age of 21.
Amazing. As you look back on your experience at London Bible College, was that a helpful, edifying experience, or?
The training at London Bible College was the best available in the country at that stage. It was rigorous. We did a university degree. We also did an equally demanding college diploma. So we were basically doing two things at the same time. The principal was Ernest Kevin. We had this orientation lecture where he walked to the front, where there was a large blackboard, and he wrote on it W-O-R-K. Work. There is no royal road to learning, he said. And then he strode off. And that was the ethic of the college. He believed in guided self-discipline, as he called it. So the bell rang at 6:30 and we were expected to be out of bed. The bell rang at 7 and we were expected to be quiet and with the Lord until 7:45. The bell rang at 7:45 and we were expected to go to breakfast. And so it was. It was guided self-discipline. And in the evening, the bell rang at 6 and we were expected to study non-stop till 9. And then the bell rang and we had evening worship and before we went to bed. And it was just an excellent foundation of personal discipline and rigorous theology and sometimes over-academic study, I think, but because of his presence, his high demands, but his burning affection for Christ, there was a certain note about the college which was extraordinary. And I studied with folk like Paul Bassett and Brian Edwards and others. We were students together.
Mm-hmm. Do you have much memory of personal interaction with Ernest Kevin? Was he the sort of person you could sit down with?
Well, remember, I went straight from school, which was unusual in those days. Most men had done national service and gone from the services to college. For me, at 18 years old, he was a terrifying figure. Yeah. Yes, obviously I had personal time with him from time to time. We all did. And sometimes we were summoned to his office where he sat on a very high chair and we had to sit in a very low armchair and they would lean over us and talk to us. And it was extremely intimidating. I was very frightened of him, to be honest. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So your pathway from London Bible College and university, was it a fairly direct one to a pastoral charge, or? It was
very direct. Yes, we went out. We weren't allowed to preach in the first year. He just wouldn't have it, Dr. Kevin. He said you've got to unlearn lots of things before you can preach well. So, but when the first year was over, we preached more often than not on Sundays, And one of my preaching assignments was to Popular Baptist Church. And then they asked me back and said, would you come again? And I did, and that's where I became the pastor.
You've given your life to the work of preaching.
Yes.
And not only preaching, but encouraging others, those who are young, those who are inexperienced in preaching. Well, do you have a working definition of preaching when you teach on the subject? What do you tend to highlight for?
Well, I have written more extensively on preaching than amongst the books published by the Banner. So there's a book called Preaching Pure and Simple, which is basically my life's work. I tell people it took me 40 years to write that. Yeah. Preaching, of course, is preaching the intended meaning of the Scriptures and applying that to the actual concrete lives of the men and women and boys and girls in front of you. So it's the exposition and application of the Word of God. I mean, that's what preaching is. There's far more to it than that, but that's the essential thing. So preaching is actually about change. It's the sermon is not is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. The end is the glory of God. God glorified through the conversion of men and women and children, and God glorified through the increasing practical holiness of men and women and boys and girls.
Yeah. And so, if you do come across a young man who has been soundly converted and senses a growing desire to preach, and he has the encouragement of those around him, perhaps in his church context, what do you have any general advice for that person who's desiring to fan into flame the gift?
Yeah, I have a fairly clear approach. I would expect that young man now to have some form of systematic engagement with the actual text of Scripture on a daily basis, and not just to be listening to the podcasts or reading the books of others explaining the text, but actually to be engaging with the text himself, just him and the bare text of Scripture, asking the Scriptures questions. The best book I know for that would be Search the Scriptures, which takes you through the whole of the Bible in 3 years. But it does teach you a certain approach and a certain rigor, coming back to that again, of really looking hard at the text and not getting everything second-hand. I would expect the young man to read some theology, and I would normally start him off on the Shorter Catechism, the commentary on the Shorter Catechism by G.I. Williamson, because I feel that gives you the bones of all the essential theology you'll need. And once the skeleton's there, you can put flesh on it, but you've just got to get the skeleton in there first. And I would expect the young man to know something about church history. So I would start him off probably on the story of the church by Rennick, but not necessarily because different people have different abilities, different flair, and I could recommend a different book to a different person, but that would be my normal approach. Get to know the Scriptures, get some basic theology, get an overall understanding of the history of the church before you do anything else. And we haven't got round yet to talking to him about the call. I mean, he's got to have certain disciplines built into his life, and they've got to be lifelong disciplines.
Wonderful. That'll be really helpful, I'm sure, to many listening in. Coming back to your life story, we're here at the Banner Conference,
yes.
And of course you've had many associations over the years. You've published various books with different publishers, but have had a long-standing relationship with the Banner.
Yes.
Can you remember your first contacts with the Banner of Truth?
Yes, I wrote to the Banner very early in my ministry because I have a burden for the inner city. All my life I've preached to people who are either illiterate or semi-literate, as well as very educated people all in the same congregation. I felt that when in my early ministry that the Banner wasn't catering sufficiently for folk who had considerable difficulty in reading. Reading wasn't part of their culture, wasn't even part of their life. Most of my early church members didn't have a book in the house. So I proposed to the Banner that was my first contact. Proposed to the Banner that they might produce a little simple booklet of outlining basic theology, and I sent them a sample, which they turned down. That led to a friendship with Ian Murray, and then I met him eventually in Liverpool when I had moved to Liverpool within a few years of going to Poplar Baptist Church. And in 1968, I came to my first Banner conference. And yes, it was unforgettable for all sorts of reasons. Professor Murray was there, W.J. Greer was there, Ernest Riesinger was there, Professor Collins from the Free Church College was there. Oh, it was glorious. And yeah, it was also intimidating. Outside the dining hall was a table, a large table, where you put your Homburg hat before you went into the meal. Because virtually everybody was in a suit, collar and a tie, and many of the Scotsmen had these Homburg hats. Do you know what a Homburg hat is?
I can't say that I do.
It's like a bowler hat which someone's done a karate chop on the top.
Right.
Yeah, and they were current amongst ministers. Yeah. But it was such an oasis coming to the Banner conference. When I started in Liverpool, I didn't know really anybody who held to the doctrines of grace in this city, apart from one minister who was was aging. And it was quite a lonely furrow. There were no Reformed churches in Liverpool. The church which had called me there was a wonderful church, but it was not a Reformed church. Even though the church officers were reading Banner books, the church itself hadn't moved to a Reformed position at that stage. And coming to that first Banner conference was life-changing. And I've come every year. I've been physically able to come ever since. Yeah.
It's wonderful. It's wonderful. Now, you've pastored congregations in London, in Liverpool, and in Lausanne.
Yes.
Interested to ask you a bit about how the French-speaking connection developed.
Yes.
How did you first get involved?
Well, 50 years ago in France, the John Calvin faculty reopened. It had been closed for some years. It reopened. And they were looking for places to send students on placements. So Paul Wells was already my friend. We'd met in Liverpool, and he was teaching systematic theology there. So we started having every February or so, for a month, a French student, or sometimes two French students, just to see a Reformed church in another context. So that led to all sorts of contacts with the French-speaking world, and eventually to French Baptists. And I was over in a conference once in France, a Baptist conference, and a group of ministers came to me and said, would I consider a pastorate in Switzerland? Because there was a little church there which was about to die and nobody seemed to care. And this was in 1982. I was very troubled by that. I mean, we had Belvedere Road Church was going through a time of great blessing. We had 26 men in our church who could preach. So I felt, well, I could safely go to the French-speaking world and take that on. Belvedere won't collapse. And one of my elders said, can you put your head on the pillow at night and forget about the Swiss church? I said, no, I can't. He said, then you must go. So we went. We inherited 12 mostly elderly people who met in a little hired horde on a Sunday. And I came with my sort of O-level French. Went to language school, but I started preaching from the very first Sunday in sort of broken French, and went to the language school in the university during the week for a year. And the Lord began to bless. We didn't know where to start, so Doll and I just asked the Lord to give us 2 young couples, and he gave us 4. And the church began to grow, and then there were conversions, and then one or two of those younger men began to preach, and after 9 years, the church had its constitution, its own eldership and diaconate, its own Swiss pastor, and the Belvedere Road Church called me back again. So I went back for a further stint in Belvedere Road Church in Liverpool. Yep.
With a clear sense that the Lord's time there for you had come to an end.
Yeah.
Well, that's wonderful. Any thoughts on the progress of gospel work in the French-speaking world at the moment?
Well, David Vaughan's here in the conference. He's going to tell us about that in a minute. In 1982, there were very few reform books in French. We're talking a dozen or 20. Very, very few indeed. That's not the case now. There are lots and lots of good resources. You couldn't read Calvin's commentaries in French in 1982. They weren't available. They're not entirely available now, but largely available. And there is at last some form of coherent reform movement at last emerging in French-speaking Europe, whereas before that just wasn't the case. We started a pastors' conference in France, but it was a very disparate group of folk who were largely suspicious of each other. That changed over some years, but yeah. But at last there is a widespread reform movement amongst French-speaking evangelicals, which is wonderful.
Since that time, you've ministered in various places. You've travelled widely to preach. Could you tell us just a little bit about your involvement with the evangelical movement of Wales?
Yes, I've been involved with the evangelical movement of Wales for more years, I can tell you. But I was asked to go down to teach part-time in the Evangelical Theological College of Wales, which I did for a number of years from Belvedere Road. And then they approached me and asked if I would go full-time, which I did. But I didn't settle, really. I felt I was being too distracted from my real calling by trying to prepare folk to jump through all sorts of academic hurdles which were required by the university. So at that point, the Evangelical Movement of Wales invited me to become, if you like, a pastor of pastors in Wales. So for several years, I travelled around Wales visiting pastors and church officers and people in Christian leadership who had various problems of various sorts. And I continued as an elder in the church of which I was we were members in Bridgend. And then on retirement, at 65, we moved to North Wales, because I was still doing some work for the Evangelical Movement of Wales, but I was doing it on an unpaid ad hoc basis then. And that's the way we remained in North Wales for 10 years until my wife died 7 years ago. Yeah. And then I moved back to Liverpool on the insistence of my family. Yeah. But Liverpool isn't really far from Wales, and there's a strong cultural connection between Liverpool and North Wales. Yeah. And I still help look after a little village church in North Wales. Yeah.
Lovely. As you say, you're active to this day in ministry.
Yes.
You also write a monthly column, which appears in Evangelicals now.
Yeah. Evangelical Times asked me to write an article, which I did, and then they asked me if I'd go regularly, write something regularly. And I said, well, yes, but not a full page, because people don't read long articles. So we agreed that I would write 700 words a month, and I've been doing that now for nearly 4 years. And I've done it as a conversation, because we all like listening into other people's conversations. And all I'm trying to do there is actually establish in the Christian mind what I would call a reformed piety, a practical view of godliness and how godliness fleshes out and what it is really. That's all I'm trying to do. I'm not addressing big issues in the culture or anything like that. I'm just trying to establish one thing: how to be a godly man or woman.
Could you talk to us a little bit about what reformed piety looks like in later life? So you describe, I think, your semi-retirement as having occurred in 2007. What would you say to people in a similar situation who've perhaps
I feel very strongly that the Christianity of the New Testament is a three-legged stool, and that there's doctrine, and that's the same for everybody. And there's ethics, how to live the Christian life, that's the same for everybody. But then there's experience, and there's a strong emphasis, I believe, in the scriptures on experience. We actually have dealings with God. We know God. We We deal with God. God deals with us in a personal way, in a living way. I feel that's grossly overlooked. I'm glad to see this. The banner's always had an experiential element to it, and it's very evident in the conference. But it's not very evident, I believe, right across the evangelical world, and I don't believe it is very evident in many nominally Reformed churches. So I'm trying to help people with their life of prayer and with their doubts and temptations and questions and all the things which might prevent them from enjoying the walk with God of which the New Testament clearly speaks.
I'm right in thinking that this is the theme of something must be felt and...
Something must be known and felt, which is a quote from a Joseph Hart film, Joseph Hart book, where he says, true religion's more than notion. Something must be known and felt, but the order is very important. It's got to be known first before it's felt, because the emotions are motions they're strong movements of the will. Well, we're not neutral to our thoughts, we're strongly attracted to some things and repulsed by others. Now, this is plain old Jonathan Edwards, of course, which I'm regurgitating here. I first read Jonathan Edwards, of course, courtesy of the Banner. But the Banner actually gave me the works of Jonathan Edwards early in my ministry. I don't know why. I can't remember exactly the circumstances, but it wasn't good for my eyesight because the print was extremely small, but it was good for my soul. And I'm glad I was introduced to Jonathan Edwards fairly early on in my ministry. Yeah.
Yeah. Wonderful. What would you say by way of encouragement to believers who may be in a semi-retired phase of life? What are some of the opportunities the Lord gives in later life?
Well, I'd say that our usefulness isn't necessarily the same, either in quality or quantity, as the years go by. And the fact that someone has for example, had a life of a preaching ministry does not mean that they'll have a preaching ministry into old age, but they'll have some other form of usefulness. And I don't think we sit down there and say, Lord, what is my usefulness? I think we look at the church and we think, well, I could help there, and I could help there, and I could help there, and I could do that. And I think that's how we discover our usefulness. I don't think we just sit in a vacuum and wait to be zapped with some divine revelation of how we're going to be useful. And I would say to folk in later life, look at the church at large, and look at the church in which you're a member, and how could it be a worse church? And then do the opposite.
Just finally, talking about the church at large, what, as you look around, both the church in the UK and further afield, what are some signs of hope that you see, and what
signs of hope?
Signs of hope, yes, and what stirs your faith for the future?
Well, a good example I would give would be 10 years ago in North Wales. We had a number of churches where the pastors were retiring or were too ill to continue. And there was a lot of wringing of hands, and what's going to happen to us? Where our church is going to collapse, and that's not what's happened at all. We've just got this fine band of men in North Wales who have come through all sorts of different routes, and some of them very surprising routes. And we've got a brotherly band of fine ministers of the gospel of all sorts of ages, many of them quite young, and I think that's massively encouraging. And we should pray the Lord of the harvest to keep up raising laborers for his harvest. I am troubled by the fact that people often wait for their pastor to get to almost retirement age before they even think about where are the next generation of men coming from? There's not enough prayer in our churches, I believe, about the Lord calling men into the pastoral ministry and calling men and women, of course, into missionary work. So I know some people say, well, there's a dearth of men coming forward. It's true, but there are some very fine young men coming up, and we thank the Lord for them. And then I go to the Aberystwyth Conference every year, and there are hundreds of young people at the Aberystwyth Conference. You can stop any of them and say, why are you here? And they always give you one of two answers, or sometimes both answers. I'm here because I've got so many friends here. That's a standard answer. I've come for the preaching. And to see hundreds of young people who actually have come for the preaching, that's massively encouraging. And then there's the Banner Youth Conference, which has just taken place. Several of our young people have come. Why? Because there's a seriousness and a joy that they've discovered in Reformed Christianity, which they've not found anywhere else. There's plenty of happiness in a superficial sense, but the serious joy which comes from a good understanding of the Word of God and its system of theology is something which they've grasped, and that's massively encouraging. And then you see men who've been in the ministry for years and years and years, and they're coming into senior years now, and they're faithful and warm and humble, and that's massively encouraging. And many of them have slaved away, if I can use that word, they've buried themselves in forgottenness for Christ's sake, but it hasn't deterred them from their zeal and their perseverance. Yeah, I'm generally encouraged, to be honest. Even though I see some big deficiencies in the modern church, I'm generally encouraged. But maybe that's just my temperament. Yeah.
No. Well, that's very encouraging, and a good note to finish on. We're grateful, Stuart, for your ministry over the years. We're grateful for the part you've played in the Banner's
Well, I'm thankful
story.
to the Banner, and thank the Lord for the Banner. I first came to the Doctrines of Grace through reading Revival Year Sermons by Spurgeon, which was one of the early Banner books. That just changed my life beyond all measure. And I've been a regular reader of Banner books ever since.
Thank you so much, and thank you for sitting down to talk with us this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.